Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're going to completely shatter how you think your eyes and brain actually work. Seriously, if you've ever wondered why we sometimes see things that aren't really there, you probably just assumed it's some sort of malfunction, right? Like a glitch in the system. But what if I told you that to truly understand hallucinations, you first have to completely unlearn the idea that your everyday perception is passive? I mean, think about it. Is your brain recording reality right now, or is it hallucinating? Most of us feel pretty confident that our eyes operate basically like video cameras, just passively capturing the world and beaming a live feed straight into our brain. But the really surprising starting point for us today is that your brain was actually never just recording reality in the first place, not even close. So let's dive right into this by comparing that classical intuitive view of vision with what modern neuroscience actually tells us. The old school view is simple. Your eyes capture light, your brain processes it, and boom, you experience it. Input first, experience second. Makes sense, right? Well, the modern view completely flips this on its head. Instead of just sitting around waiting for information, your brain is actually actively predicting what's out there. And your senses, they're really just there to correct those predictions. Which brings us to part one, the controlled hallucination, and how perception actually works. As cognitive scientists love to point out, you experience, in some sense, the world that you expect to experience. Because your brain is constantly generating hypotheses about how the world works, instead of just waiting around for sensory data, your normal everyday perception isn't passive at all. In fact, scientists have literally described it as a controlled hallucination. Crazy, right? Now, the technical term for this whole process is predictive coding. Mechanically, your brain is running a massive internal model. It generates predictions, which we call priors, and then compares those against the incoming sensory data. From there, it computes the mismatch, or the prediction error. So your actual conscious perception is really just a weighted combination of your internal priors and the actual input. The higher brain regions send their predictions down, and only the surprise, the stuff your brain absolutely didn't predict, gets sent back up. So why on earth would we evolve to see the world this way? Well, honestly, raw sensory data is just incredibly ambiguous. A 2D pattern of light hitting your retina could technically match an infinite number of 3D scenes. Sound waves alone don't just automatically tell you if you're hearing a distinct word or just random background noise. Your brain resolves all this ambiguity by relying on priors, which are built up from a lifetime of experience. Trying to process all that raw, from-scratch data every single second, that would simply be way too slow and computationally expensive for us to survive. And the wild thing is, this predictive system is incredibly useful, about 99% of the time. Moving on to part two, the balance shift, or what happens when the dial turns. There are basically three main conditions that can tip this super delicate balance between prediction and sensory input. First, if you have weak sensory input, like if you're standing in a really dim room or experiencing vision loss, your brain's predictions naturally get relatively more weight. Second, if you have overly confident or rigid priors, those expectations will completely override your senses, even when the sensory input coming in is perfectly fine. And finally, certain neurochemical states can actually reduce your brain's ability to even compare the prediction against reality, meaning that checking step itself just completely breaks down. Let's look at part three, the hallucination spectrum. Same mechanism, different triggers. When we zoom out and look across this incredible spectrum of phenomena, whether we're talking about pareidolia, Charles Bonnet syndrome, sleep paralysis, or psychosis, I want you to notice the common thread here. The core issue is exactly the same across the board. You either weaken the sensory check, or you strengthen the prediction, and suddenly, the prediction part becomes what you consciously see. The key differences across all these experiences really just come down to which specific piece breaks down, and how much insight the person retains that what they're seeing isn't actually real. So let's start with the absolute mildest version of this, pareidolia. This happens to literally everyone. Because recognizing faces mattered so enormously for our evolutionary survival, our face detection priors are just incredibly strong. So almost any ambiguous input with a rough arrangement of shapes, like a cloud, an electrical outlet, or even a piece of burnt toast, gets magically pulled into being interpreted as a face. And interestingly enough, research shows that how readily you let your priors win in these situations is a trait that actually connects to a proneness for delusional ideation. 10 to 30%. That is the staggering estimated percentage of people with significant visual impairment in both eyes who experience what's called Charles Bonnet syndrome. This is a truly fascinating condition where vision loss leads directly to visual hallucinations.
The leading explanation for this is the release phenomenon. Because the brain is losing actual visual input, it causes this sort of hyperexcitability in the visual association areas. It's kind of like a phantom limb, but for your eyes. The prediction machinery is still totally intact, but the sensory input is gone, so the predictions just run wildly. But critically, folks with this condition retain full insight that the hallucinations are absolutely not real.
Now, moving a bit further down the spectrum, we have sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations. This is basically a sleep stage glitch, a total dissociation of your REM and wake states. Your dreaming brain, which is essentially making unconstrained predictions with zero real sensory input to check against, stays partly active while you're semi-awake. Because motor commands and sensory feedback are structurally blocked during this phase, these wild dream predictions just overlay directly onto your real bedroom. And here's a super interesting side note. Neurochemically, serotonin 2A receptor activation plays a massive role here, which is exactly the same receptor targeted by classic psychedelics. Okay, let's get into part 4, breaking the illusions and dispelling some major hallucination myths. Probably the most common misconception out there is that seeing things means your brain is broken in some terrifying categorical way. But the reality? Hallucinating isn't some alien malfunction. It is the exact same predictive system that lets you recognize a friend's face at a glance, or understand a slurred word, or fill in your visual blind spot every single second of the day. It's really just a dial that has shifted, not an on and off switch. Another massive misconception is that hallucinations always equal psychiatric illness, and this is just completely false. In fact, the World Health Organization explicitly classifies conditions like Charles Bonnet syndrome as completely unrelated to mental and behavioral disorders. The vivid imagery experienced by someone losing their eyesight isn't symbolic. It's not some hidden message welling up from the unconscious mind. It's literally just a mechanical consequence of lost sensory input. Finally, people so often think that if an experience is incredibly vivid, well, it simply must be really there, or that our brains are just fundamentally untrustworthy, but neither of those is true. Vividness is just a property of how strongly your brain is weighting its prediction. And honestly, because this incredible predictive system usually gets it absolutely right, allowing us to navigate crowded rooms, catch flying baseballs, and read facial expressions safely, our everyday perception remains highly, highly trustworthy. And that brings us to part 5. Test your perception. Time for a quick check. Let's see if we can actually apply this new mental model we've been talking about. First question. In predictive coding terms, what two things does the brain compare to generate a conscious perception? You got your answer? It's the brain's internal predictions, which we call priors, compared against the incoming sensory data. And remember, the difference between them is the prediction error. Okay, next question. Why does vision loss specifically, not just getting older, but actual physical visual impairment, trigger Charles Bonnet syndrome? Think about it for a second. The answer is the release phenomenon. The deafferation, or the loss of sensory input, causes hyperexcitability in the visual areas of the brain, basically letting the brain's visual predictions run completely unchecked. Third question, what two phenomena combine to cause someone to see a shadow person sitting on their chest right as they wake up, completely unable to move? We've all heard stories about this. Well, the answer is a combination of a hypnagogic hallucination, which is that unconstrained dream prediction overlaying reality, and sleep paralysis, which is the persistence of REM muscle atonia literally blocking your motor commands. Question 4. What is the key mechanistic difference between a Charles Bonnet hallucination and a psychosis-related hallucination? This is crucial. In Charles Bonnet syndrome, the sensory input is genuinely gone, so the predictions step up to fill the void. But in psychosis, the sensory input is often perfectly fine. The issue is that the brain's priors are weighted so heavily that they actually override accurate sensory signals. So let's wrap up with a final, kind of provocative thought here. If your everyday reality is truly just a controlled hallucination that simply happens to match the outside world, how much of what you see today is actually there, and how much is just what you expected to see? Take that question with you as you navigate your beautifully constructed, heavily predicted world today. Thanks for exploring with me, and definitely keep questioning your reality.